You see, people believe, a lot of people, that in order to make a difference or to change the world, you have to be someone like a Dr. Martin Luther King or a John F. Kennedy or a Rosa Parks, and that you have to change a group of people. But really, all it takes is just one person making a difference in the life of someone else. Hello, my name is Cassandra Sewell, and I am a storyteller. I specialize in historical stories. I tell people that what I do is share history. And what you'll discover is that my history is your history, and your history is my history. The story that I am going to share with you is a story that I call Just One. You see, people believe, a lot of people, that in order to make a difference or to change the world, you have to be someone like a Dr. Martin Luther King or a John F. Kennedy or a Rosa Parks, and that you have to change a group of people. But really, all it takes is just one person making a difference in the life of someone else. You see, all it takes is just one person to change another person's life. You see, life is a journey, and it starts with the first breath that you take, and it ends with your last breath. And sometimes that journey that we call life can last for a couple of minutes, and sometimes we're fortunate enough for it to last for decades. You see, life is filled with pain and it's filled with joy. Life is filled with hate and it's filled with love. Life can be filled with violence, but it can also be filled with kindness. You see, all it takes is just one person to make a difference. And that person can be a family member, it can be a friend, it can be a total stranger. All it takes is just one action, an action of violence, an action of love. All it takes is just one to have an impact on the life of a little colored girl in Mississippi. All it takes is just one to change the destiny of a family. The story that I'm going to share with you, well, I need to first get you familiar with the two main characters. The first character is a 16-year-old colored girl in 1958 in Mississippi. Her name is Theola Williams, and she's the youngest of 9 children. Her family, when she was born, was very, very poor. Well, actually, we don't call it poor because they were below poor. They were so poor that they could only afford the P and the O, and we call that po. And once a week, her mother would gather up all of her children and she'd take them to the local trash dump. And she and her siblings told themselves that they were pirates looking for a secret treasure. They would be adults before they understood the purpose of those trips. You see, Theola's parents were named Ella and George. They were married. Now, George would work all week and he would get paid on Friday, but they didn't see him till Sunday after he had spent his entire paycheck. And so because of that, Ella had to figure out how to provide for her children on her own. You see, when her children were hungry, it was her neighbors that would bring over cakes of cornbread for them to eat. When her children didn't have clothes to wear, it was her neighbors that came over and bought her the hand-me-downs from their children so that her children could go to school. And When she needed a babysitter, it was her neighbors that volunteered to watch her children while she ran errands. You see, that's what we mean when we say it takes an entire village to raise a child. Now, George, he grew up as one of two children. He was the only son. He had an older sister. And because of that, he was very, very spoiled. I mean, by the time he was 16 back in the 1930s, he was the only young Black man in town to have his own car. He was so used to getting what he wanted, when he wanted it, and how he wanted it. You see, Ella's background wasn't as fortunate as George's. She was one of two children, but her parents were sharecroppers. And her father would go out every day to work out in the fields. He'd leave early in the mornings, and he'd leave his wife and his two children at home in bed. And as he worked out in those fields, his wife would be at home, and she would clean the house. She would cook the meals. And when he came home in the evenings, she had his supper ready for him. One day, he had gone to work, and when he came home, the house wasn't clean. Supper wasn't cooked. And when he went into the bedroom, he found Ella and her brother sitting in the bed with their mom. At first, he thought that maybe she was just asleep. But when he reached over to wake her up, she didn't move. And that's when he realized his wife was dead. She evidently had died in her sleep, and he had left his two babies at home alone in the bed with their dead mom for the entire day. He always blamed himself, wondered why he didn't know that she was dead before he left for work. Well, after she was laid to rest, first thing he did was he went looking for another wife because he needed somebody to help him raise those two babies. And he found a woman, a new wife, and she had 6 children of her own. And she didn't particularly like Ella. So by the time Ella was 12 years old, she got married for the first time. She had 2 children, but she had a problem. Her first husband was abusive. He would take the gun and shoot at her feet and tell her to dance. She tried telling his family about him, but whenever she did that, if he was drinking, he would turn on them. So every day she would pray that he would stop. He would stop hitting her. But you got to be careful what you pray for, because sometimes God answers it, but he doesn't necessarily answer it the way you want him to answer it. And God decided to call him home. Well, it wasn't long after that that Ella met George. That was Theola's father. And his mom didn't particularly like Ella. She felt like he had married beneath himself. So whenever George would have these moments where he stayed away from home for the entire weekend, no one helped him. So Ella and her children had to fend for themselves. And all of them, when they got old enough, they would go to school in the day, and then in the evenings, they had jobs. And they would take whatever money they earned and give it to their mom. Now, let me introduce you to the second character. The second character was a white woman named Miss Dorothy. She was about 28 years old, and she was from Canada. And she had moved to Mississippi for her husband's job. He worked with the pipelines, laying pipes. And when she moved to town, the first thing she did was she went to church. Because you see, when you're new in an area, the first thing you join is the church, because that's the center of the community. And that's where you'll meet people. So she and her husband became very active in church. She joined the women's group. She joined the Bible study. And as she got to know these women, Miss Dorothy had 3 kids. And one of the ladies in her study group said, Dorothy, you know what, girl? You need to get you a nanny. You need to get somebody to help you raise them their children that you got. Well, that's how Viola met Dorothy. You see, in the meantime, Viola had this dream. She wanted to go to college. She knew her parents couldn't afford to send her, but she had a great aunt who didn't have any children, and she was a teacher. And she promised Viola that if she got good grades and she graduated, then she would pay for her to go to college. She even decided to write up some papers that would make sure so that if something happened to her, Viola would still get the money to go to college. But you know something? Life is strange. Sometimes it throws little obstacles in your way. About 2 weeks before Viola was supposed to graduate from high school, her great aunt died. And at that moment, Viola's dreams had died. She knew her parents couldn't afford to send her to school. And the family searched, but they never could find those papers that her great aunt had left. So Viola was trying to come to grips with her future. She was afraid that she would have the same future that every little colored girl back in the 1950s had in Mississippi. She was going to end up being someone's maid or someone's nanny. Well, after about 2 weeks, Viola graduated from high school. And she went into work, and Miss Dorothy came up to her and she said, Viola, she said, we're going to have to leave because they're going to move us with my husband's job. And I want you to come with us. I want you to become my children's permanent nanny. Viola looked at Miss Dorothy. See, she had never told Miss Dorothy about her dreams. That day she shared them with her. And she said, Miss Dorothy, she said, do you mind? Could you give me a week to think on it and I'll let you know? Well, what Viola didn't realize was that her words hadn't fallen on deaf ears. Miss Dorothy had heard the words that she said, and when her husband came home, she told him, she said, you know what, we need to help that dear child. She wants to go to college. So the two of them decided that they would go to the church and talk to some of the church members to see if they could help this little girl go to college. But you see, the church is the center sometimes of a lot of hate. Her husband, he went to the men's group and told them about the little colored girl that worked for him and that wanted to go to college and how they wanted to help her. But they looked at him and they said, you really expect us to take our hard-earned money and give it to some little colored girl? And that's when they knew that they probably wasn't going to get any help doing this. But Miss Dorothy decided that she would talk to the women's group. I mean, what did she have to lose, right? And when she mentioned it to the women's group about how she wanted to help her little colored nanny, one woman said to her, she said, now, Dorothy, if I help Viola go to school, then who gonna cook my meals? Who gonna clean my house? Who gonna help me with my children? But there were some women in that group that had a kind heart like Miss Dorothy, and they wanted to help. So when they would go home in the evenings and they'd go to wash their husband's clothes, they would empty out the pockets, and any money they found in them pockets, they gave it to that little colored girl. You see, I tell folks that women are very, very powerful. They have more power than they realize. Well, come that Saturday, Viola was sitting out on the front porch with her mama and her brothers and stuff, and they saw Miss Dorothy pull up in her car. And when she got out of her car, she told Theola's brother to get the trunk that she had in the back seat to bring it out. He went and got the trunk, and Theola and her mama opened it. And when they opened that trunk, in there was everything she would need to go to college. There was clothing, there was underwear, there was toothpaste, toothbrushes, deodorant. And you got to understand, Theola and them didn't use toothpaste and stuff. They used baking soda for everything. And in this trunk, there was a Bible. And one of the pages was marked. And when they opened that Bible, there was a verse highlighted and it said, "Study to show yourself approved." And in that Bible was an envelope. And when they opened that envelope, there was $250. Now, back in 1958, $250 was enough to pay for room, board, tuition, and fees for a whole semester in college. Theola's mom started screaming and yelling, and Theola began to cry. And Theola looked at her mom and she said, "Mama, I can't go to college, Mama. We can't spend this kind of money, Mama. We need this money." And her mama told her, say, "Well, you shut up. So you're going to go to college." "But Mama, if I go, y'all can't afford to keep me there." She said, "Don't you worry about that. We're going to handle that when we get to it." Come that fall, Theola went off to college. And when the semester break came, she wanted to come home, but her mama wouldn't let her because she said, "If you come home, we can't send you back." And what Theola didn't realize was during that first semester, her brothers and her sisters all took extra jobs and they put all that money aside. So by the time her second semester came along, they had managed to save up another $250. And that got her through her second semester of college. That summer, Theola came home. And the first thing she did was she went looking for Miss Dorothy because she wanted to let her know that she appreciated what she had done. But by the time she got back to town, Miss Dorothy's husband's job had moved them to another town. And Theola never was able to find her. You see, with that simple act that Miss Dorothy did, what she did was she showed a little colored girl in 1958 Mississippi that she mattered. She showed her that her dreams was just as important to someone else as they were to her. What she did was she let Theola's mother know that there was somebody else out there that cared about her child. Well, Theola went on back to school. Eventually, she married a young man by the name of Horace, and he helped her finish up the rest of her school years. And she always remembered Miss Dorothy, but she never could find her. So she had children. She had 4 of them. And she would tell her children about what Miss Dorothy had done and how Miss Dorothy had changed her life. And they would tell her, they would say, "Mama, so you got to find Miss Dorothy. You got to let her know how things turned out." They tried to find her, but they never could. So after a certain amount of time, they figured Miss Dorothy was probably dead. But in the meantime, Theola went back to college. She got her a master's degree in education. She sent her children to college. She had grandchildren, and they went to college. Well, after many years, Theola and her husband decided that it was time for them to retire. They moved back to Mississippi because by then they were living in Louisiana. And one day, she was in the bank, and a gentleman walked up to her, someone that she knew from when she was young. He was an attorney now. And he asked her, how did her life turn out? And she told him the story of Miss Dorothy and where her life was at now. And he told her, he said, "Theola," he said, "I have a radio program." He said, "Do you mind if I share your story on the radio?" And she said, sure. Then after a couple of weeks, he called her. He said, Theola, he said, do you mind if I try to find Miss Dorothy? And she said, sure, but she's probably dead now because by then Theola was about 74 years old. So he went looking for Miss Dorothy. And after many weeks and many months, after many letters and many phone calls, he found Miss Dorothy. Miss Dorothy was well into her late 80s, and she was living in a senior center in Houston, Texas. And me, I am the oldest of Theola's children. And she called me and told me she wanted to go see Miss Dorothy. So I took my mother to Houston, Texas to meet Miss Dorothy. They had not seen each other in over 60 years. And when she walked into the room, Miss Dorothy took her hands and held my mother's face. And she looked at her and she said, you still look the same. I would never forget your face. You see, Miss Dorothy was just one woman that did one act of kindness for a young colored girl in Mississippi. And as we talked to Miss Dorothy, we discovered that my mother had talked about Miss Dorothy to us, and Miss Dorothy had talked about my mother to her children. And I sat there and I asked her, I said, why did you do what you did back then, all those years ago in Mississippi in 1958? She said, I did it because I knew it was the right thing to do. And I asked her, I said, well, what happened after this? She said, I lost some friends. And she said, but you know what? I wouldn't have changed it for the world. She said, me and my husband came home one evening and we found a cross burning in our yard. She said, but I have never regretted what I did. You see, Miss Dorothy was one person doing one act of kindness. And because of Miss Dorothy's kindness, it changed the destiny of our family. My mother has her master's degree in education. She has 4 children. 3 of us have master's degrees in engineering. 1 of us has a PhD in education. And one of those 3 engineering majors has a law degree and she's a corporate attorney. Of her grandchildren, she has 2 grandchildren with master's degrees in computer engineering. She has a granddaughter with a PhD in pharmacy. And she has another granddaughter with a PhD in physics. You see, like I said, Miss Dorothy was one person doing one act of kindness that changed the destiny of a family. And she is my just one.